So that leads to the Continental Congress and the decision to declare independence from the crown. And as I've said many times, it is, of course, Thomas Jefferson who is asked to write the Declaration of Independence. It's a remarkable document. I don't know how this would work. That's actually a hot link, that image of the Declaration, to the document that's in a more readable form. But since I'm going to convert this to a video, I don't know how that would work because it will take us to a web browser. So I'm not going to touch it. But you can obviously Google the Declaration. It's a powerfully written document. Jefferson is clearly a man with an eloquent voice, but he plagiarizes John Locke. So I've said many, many times, if you do what Jefferson does in the Declaration of Independence when you write a paper for me, I'm going to flunk you for plagiarism, right? Because, as I've already noted, he just kind of lifts large passages from the second treatise, like we are all endowed with certain inalienable rights, et cetera, et cetera. So Declaration, independence is declared, and that's an act of war, of course, obviously. Now, we know the end of that war, so there's no need in going through that. But what really matters, I think, to us is how, following success in the War of Independence, Americans seek to govern themselves. And this is actually a pretty rare moment for a lot of countries. Britain, for example, has never had this kind of opportunity. Because Britain's Britain's political history is evolutionary rather than, say, revolutionary, like French history, right, where the French have had many occasions to sit down at the table and say, how shall we govern ourselves? The Brits really never have, and this is the opportunity that Americans are confronted with, or presented with here. How shall we now govern ourselves as an independent sovereign state? It's clear that the framers, classical liberals that they are, have two fears. I would say they have two fundamental fears. One is the fear of a tyrannical government. They just fought a war against what they had come to see as a government that had violated the social contract, violated their rights as British subjects, and under Lockean thinking, the right of revolution had become theirs. So on the one hand, they had this very clear, predominant fear of government with too much power. They also have another one, however, but it's going to kind of, get less consideration at this moment in American history. The other fear that they have is fear of the masses, fear of mobocracy or Athenian-style direct democracy. None of them have that vision in mind. Many people will say, we don't have a democracy, we have a republic, and I often find those distinctions in contemporary parlance meaningless and ideologically purposeful. But it's clear that they did not want a direct democracy. But they clearly did not want a government with too much power. So their solution, as I say here, is a confederal system. Now, what that means is there are one could say there's a continuum on which any political system can be said to reside. A continuum with respect to the degree to which power, governing authority, is located, situated, or concentrated at the center, or the top, if you will. A unitary system of government is what Britain knows today, where, was it our class? Yeah, I was just talking about this, where in the unitary system of government like Great Britain, London controls a great deal throughout the country. For example, it maintains control over the public educational system throughout Great Britain. So no matter where one goes to public school, actually public school means something else in British language, but the public educational system, if you are in southern England or in the Midlands or wherever, you are, at least theoretically, going to enjoy the same kind of educational opportunities as you would living somewhere else. But I told you the story about moving from Maryland, the third highest rated, third best funded system of education in the United States, to Louisiana, the 49th, and tested in the placement exam into the 10th grade as I started the third grade. So on one end, you have a unitary system where the center kind of maintains sovereignty and control of many, many, if not most things. At the very other end is a confederal constitution, and that's where the center has very little sovereignty and control. In today's world, I think perhaps the best known and most representative of a true confederal institutional arrangement is the United Nations, where these central institutions like the Security Council in no way function like a domestic government. Right? Sovereignty remains with the member states of the UN. Switzerland is a confederal system. Cantons within the Swiss system have retained very important powers and authorities. And in some cantons within Switzerland, women did not get the right to vote until the 1970s. So Switzerland, UN, at the other end, the confederal system. In the middle is a federal system, which we will see is where the U.S. eventually lands. But the first experiment in constitutional government is a confederal. Now, why does this matter? Why are we taking the time to talk about the Constitution of the United States? What's the so what, or answer to the so what? Why do constitutions matter? Well, I kind of think of it as in terms of a game, right? Constitutions establish rules of the game. And since I'm an American from Indiana and went to Louisville with a great basketball, I think in terms of basketball. So let's take the game of basketball just for a moment to make my point. Right? The game of basketball is governed by rules, as is any game. Right? And rules seem unimportant when they are just well established and well legitimated. And we therefore kind of lose sight of the impact of the various rules of the game on the way the game is played, how it plays out, and the outcomes and all that kind of stuff. So let's take the game of basketball and think about just changing one rule alone. Okay, so we have this one standard rule in basketball that you get 5 fouls. And if you don't know anything about basketball, a foul is when you make inappropriate, unacceptable contact with one who's trying to shoot the ball. Right? You get 5 of those, and your 5th foul, you're ejected from the game. So 5 fouls and you're out is the rule. Okay? Now, as I say, that's such an institutionalized part of the game of basketball that we probably lose sight of how central that rule is to the very nature of the game. What if we just change that one rule to say 10 fouls and you're out? So think about that for a moment. If we change the 5 fouls and you're out rule to 10 rules, 10 fouls and you're out rule, how would the game of basketball change? So just kind of reflect on that for a moment. You now get 10 fouls before you have to sit down. What would that do to the game of basketball? In what ways would basketball change? Well, I suggest that it would change in some very important fundamental respects. The fact that you now get 10 cracks at the opposing players before you have to sit down means that it's going to be a much more aggressive physical game than it is, right? So that's one thing. It just becomes, the very character of the game changes. It's a much more aggressive game, much more like football than basketball, right? Because it's more aggressive, because you now get 10 shots at an opposing shooter before you have to sit down, that means the physicality of the game will lead to different kinds of players actually succeeding in the game. We're going to get more Shaquille O'Neals in the game than we will get finesse players that do well in contemporary basketball, because it's going to become this game much more like football. So the nature of the game who plays the game will now change, and it will change in other ways. If you get 10 cracks before you have to sit down at those trying to score, what's likely to happen to the outcomes of these games? What's going to happen to scoring? If the average collegiate Division I college basketball game, scores were in the 70s and 80s, what's going to happen to those scores with changing this but one rule from 5 to 10 fouls? I argue that the scores would plummet. I think we'd be talking about games that end, in the 20s and 30s. Right? Because this is going to be a heck of a lot harder to score when people get 10 shots at you before they actually have to sit down. So the scores. So everything about the game changes. And all we've done is change but one rule. And that's why I think constitutions matter, because constitutions are essentially the set of rules that determine how the game of politics is played. So as we go through, this segment of the basic rules, try to remember why it matters, because it is the essence of that which determines the character of the game, who plays it, by what processes, with what levels of assertiveness or aggressiveness, and the outcomes are all, in many respects, determined by the constitutional framework. So the first approach to governance after the success in the War of Independence is known as the Articles of Confederation. And it lasted from 1781. It came into effect. They started debating it in 1777. It took until 1781 for it to get ratified and come into effect. And it lasted until 1789. So the first experiment in self-government was this Articles of Confederation. And it was clearly a states' rights constitution. And in this context, I don't mean l'État, the state, but the individual states that had colonies, now states within the U.S. Confederation. It is clearly a constitution that is favoring the autonomy, the sovereignty, the rights, the privileges of the states at the expense of the central government. That's the most important thing to remember. There's a reasonable basis for calling this new order, but a league of friendship among essentially sovereign states. It's not really, I think, reasonable to conceive of the new system of governance as a state as we would recognize it today. Much more like a league of friendship, as I'm saying here. The states' rights constitution meant that there was no federal executive. Right? There was no presidency or prime minister. It just did not exist. Right? Nor a federal judiciary to adjudicate disputes either between states or between parties with respect to questions about consistency with the framing document, the Articles of Confederation. There's no institution to adjudicate disputes at a national level. The states had all those powers and authorities. So there were governors in each state, but there was no president or prime minister. The federal legislature, the one national institution that the Articles did create, had very few formal powers. It was granted the power to establish and direct the armed forces. Okay, fair enough. The national government had the authority over a national military. It gave Congress the right to declare war and sign treaties and do the business of diplomacy. It gave Congress the right to coin currency and to borrow money nationally, internationally, to for whatever purposes the federal government may have or the national government may have. And ostensibly, Congress had the right to settle disputes between states. But normally, of course, that's the business of an independent judiciary, not the hands of a deeply politicized institution like a legislature. Right? And you could only amend the Articles, the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, by complete unanimity of all of the 13 states, making it essentially absolutely impossible to change this framework of governance. Right? So, as I've said, states' rights, Congress had, under this kind of states' rights constitution, Congress had no power to tax. If Congress has no power to tax, if it has no basis for its own source of revenue, how does it pay off debts that it is empowered to incur? It's not clear. Well, it would have to rely on contributions, voluntary contributions from the states to the federal government to pay debts that the federal government had the right to incur. But if you're a foreign lender, why would you lend to the American Congress when it has no power to raise its own revenue to pay back the debt you're about to, you're about to engage in? So Congress, it turned out, could not raise this. So the federal government could not raise revenue, and it will become very clear that that's a very serious problem. As I say, it had to rely on states for its funds, and that's just a unacceptably precarious position for a central government to be in. It couldn't pay debts, and therefore was not a reliable borrower. And as I say, who would lend to such a government, right? It couldn't draft soldiers. Right? So yes, it's formally given the right to raise an army and be in control of the army, but it's got no independent authority to establish that army without state volunteers, giving up soldiers. So then that meant that the federal government could not do perhaps the most fundamental thing that governments are expected to do, and that's to protect the nation. It couldn't protect it from the growing problem of coastal piracy, for example. Right? It had to rely again on states and the voluntary contributions of those states that came or did not come to execute or carry out that principal function of states, which is national defense. It could not, the federal government or the national government, Congress, could not regulate interstate commerce, meaning between the U.S. and the rest of the world. It could not impose tariffs, for example. And as a result of all of these things, the national currency was worthless, right? There was no basis for global confidence in the American currency, in the American dollar, given the inability of the central government to do the things absolutely essential to establish confidence in its currency or to back up its currency. So it was very, very early on seen as a deeply troubled approach to governance. But it finally came to a head in 1786 with what became, and you read about Shays Rebellion, when the federal government could not even pay what was owed to veterans, and therefore many veterans, including Captain Shay, were finding themselves foreclosed on. Banks were foreclosing on their farms, and they were, facing destitution. And so Captain Shay organized in Massachusetts a rebellion among other veterans, and stormed in Springfield, Massachusetts, an armory, and the federal government was essentially powerless to put it down. It had no capacity to defeat Shays Rebellion because it needed states to surrender volunteer forces and resources to do that very sort of thing. And it was the grave trouble that the central government had in trying to deal with Shays Rebellion that was the last straw for the Articles of Confederation. It finally put enough fear, into the hearts of those who mattered. Property owners, for example. Shays Rebellion was fundamentally a threat to property. Right? Because if banks can't foreclose on property owners that are unable or unwilling to pay loans, then there's just no property rights system. Right? I'm not saying that Shays Rebellion was unjust. That's not for me to say, but it's clear that you've got fundamental flaws in a property rights system if there's no capacity to enforce the basic rules of a private property system, like say foreclosure for failure to pay debts. So what this means is that the founders of the Articles of Confederation are going to give up on the Articles and convene in what is essentially an act of treason, I might add, a constitutional convention to write a new one. They are not empowered. There is no provision within the Articles to do this. Right? So I think it's reasonable to say that The Constitutional Convention that drafts the current Constitution of the United States was, in fact, a treasonous act. It was completely contrary to the principles of the governing document, the governing framework of the Republic at the time. But they do it anyways. So they're obviously going to move in the direction of more central authority, but those fears persist. Right? I mean, the American founders are still classical liberals with these fears of the potential for a tyrannical government, as well as the fear of a tyrannical mob. Those two fears, fear of governmental tyranny, and fear of kind of popular tyranny, are the kind of central animating forces for the major debates at the Constitutional Convention. The fundamental question, as I state here, is how to solve the problems of the Articles of Confederation, which were essentially that it was entirely too weak of a system of government, without endangering the liberty that is at the heart of liberal theory. Right? I mean, if there's anything to liberalism, it's liberty. Right? So there were three big debates at the Constitutional Convention that kept the delegates there for quite a long time. They were difficult debates to resolve. The three debates were, first, between big states and small states. And you'll see why that was the case. But basically it comes down to how are we going to represent in a way that's fair and just and acceptable, politically acceptable. So how are we going to find a way to draft a constitution that will appreciate that states in this republic are not of equal size, not of equal population, and therefore not of equal wealth. Right? How do we represent them all in a fair and just and politically acceptable way? First debate, big states versus small states. Obviously the next one, northern versus southern, and that debate will obviously not end until well after the Civil War, if it's over yet. And then the third is this question of, federal versus state authority. How much power do we vest at the center? How much do we retain at the level of the state? So with respect to the first debate, big states versus small states, classically we talk about two kind of opposing visions and then a third compromise. The first plan that was addressed and discussed represented the interests coming from Virginia delegates, big states. It favored a strong national government, and one could argue that big states would be more comfortable with a strong national government since they will have a higher level of representation in that government. So the Virginia plan argues for a much stronger national government. It clearly specifies the need for a federal executive and a federal judiciary. It proposes a bicameral legislature, which is actually kind of unusual for the day, right? Most Britain, with its House of Lords and House of Commons, is equally kind of unusual in some sense. Many are simply single chamber legislature, unicameral legislature. It proposes two for reasons we'll see. The size of a state's delegation would be based on the level of taxes levied on state residents. So basically population, right? Larger populated states would get more representatives in Congress. Obviously a big state, bias. Because that would mean that the larger states would have the dominant share of the congressional of Congress, right? So they would be able to kind of dictate the terms of policymaking to smaller states. Well, obviously that's not going to be popular with smaller states. So in response, New Jersey, a small state, responds with what becomes known as the New Jersey Plan, an alternative approach. It proposes a weaker national government, much more like that under the Articles of Confederation, because as a smaller state, it predicted that it would have a lower level of control or degree of influence on the national government, so it wants to weaken it. Right? It proposes to have a national executive, like was absent completely under the Articles, but it wants a multi-member. It wants a presidency consisting of 3 individuals who would have to kind of work as a committee to carry out the duties of an executive. It proposes a unicameral legislature with an equality among states, 1 vote per state, right? So regardless of the size, regardless of how many people live in Virginia versus New Jersey, the New Jersey plan says all states will be equal in Congress, obviously reflecting the values and interests of small states. Well, these seem and were fundamentally irreconcilable visions. In comes Connecticut, right? With the famous Connecticut Compromise, right? It proposes a single-person executive, which made sense to most people. A multi-member executive was seen by many as kind of an unworkable solution. It adopted the Virginia plan for a bicameral legislature because it will accommodate both the big and small state views. Because it's a dual-chamber, bicameral legislature, the House of Representatives would be based on the population. So this is in favor of Virginia plan, right? In other words, based on tax revenue, which is a function of population, that's how many delegates or members of, how many representatives you get in the House. So that's a big state win, but the other chamber, the upper house, the Senate, is, as New Jersey wanted, equal representation for states. Every state would get 2 senators. So we have a kind of classic compromise here. The small states get their Senate, the big states get the House, and they will, of course, have to learn how to compromise, and that's something they'll deal with later down the road. And the Connecticut Compromise went on to endow, or proposed to endow, the federal government with the powers that it did not have under the Articles of Confederation. Most importantly, the power to tax it by itself, to regulate interstate commerce, to establish tariffs and kind of control commerce with foreign nations, to maintain its army and navy and raise it itself. So many of the powers, many of the most critical powers that the government did not enjoy under the Articles, the Connecticut Compromise endows the government. And we see that plan wins the day, right? There's also this northern-southern debate, of course, and that's essentially over slavery. Right? But within the context of the Constitutional Convention and the design of a legislature, the issue is, what do we do about the population of slaves that are in the Americas? How do they count? How do they matter? Northern states, didn't want them to count at all. I mean, they're not deemed citizens in any way in southern states, and most northern states have gotten rid of slavery by now. But southern states wanted them counted as, part of the population, because that would obviously increase the size of their congressional delegation. But, it was pretty hard to sell that slaves represented citizens of southern states. So in one of the more unsavory moments in American constitutional history, a compromise is made, and that is to count slaves as 3/5 of a person. And what this has been understood to be, I think appropriately so, is the articulation of the meaning of black people in American life and in the American constitutional framework, that they are, in fact, being constitutionally recognized as less than fully human. They are quantitatively 3/5 of a human. That compromise will just expire. It will never be repealed. It will never be revoked. It will never be rejected formally in any way. It will just go away when Lincoln abolishes slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation. So for many, this is one of the ugliest elements of the American historical experience, where we actually write into the constitutional framework a quantitative assessment of the humanity of black people, that they are quite evidently less than fully human. And there was just no serious discussion of abolition because they understood, Northern delegates understood, that abolition was just off the table for Southern delegates. And if there was any broach of that, Southern delegates were going to walk away and they were going to be stuck with the Articles of Confederation, which nobody wanted. So no meaningful discussion of abolition at the Constitutional Convention. It will take the Civil War to bring that debate to an end. And then lastly, what the big one, I suppose, is, or the more complex one, is how do we fix this system of government under the Articles that is characterized by too weak of a government? How do we strengthen the American central government in a way that does not, realize the founders' worst fears, which is creating a tyrannical government? How do we do that? What do we do? Well, this is again where all this liberal thought, French and British liberal thought, becomes so critically important. Once the Constitution was written and agreed upon at the convention, it then became necessary to sell the new document to the American people because it had to be ratified by the states. And the propaganda campaign to do so in favor of the Constitution became known, or became compiled in what is now known as the Federalist Papers. And at many places in the Federalist Papers, Montesquieu is quoted directly from his tome L'Esprit des Lois, that the most important thing we can do to prevent tyranny is to avoid having executive and legislative and judicial powers into the hands of the same person or the same branch. We must separate powers, following Montesquieu's advice. And so, of course, that's what they do. They establish separate branches of government, endowing each with its own responsibilities and each with a capacity to check the actions and responsibilities of the other branches. Separation of powers, or checks and balances, as the system becomes known. Again, classic it is just Montesquieu's ideas put into practice. Each branch having the capacity to restrict the actions of the others is the central idea here. So, in the Constitution, the first article is about Congress, not the presidency. So I think it's worth mentioning that for the framers, the real power, the real business of politics, the real locus of authority would be the legislative branch. That was, the British experience because of, over time, how the Crown had lost its power to Parliament. So Article 1 deals with Congress and is far longer than any other article in the Constitution. That's no accident. It's because, as I say, it's where the founders assumed the center of political gravity would exist. And indeed, for many, 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 many decades, until the birth of the modern presidency, starting perhaps with Teddy Roosevelt, it is Congress where political careers are made. People seeking serious, lifelong careers in politics pursue it in Congress. They didn't seek the presidency as a way to achieve prominence in politics. It was Congress where the action lay. So Article 1 gives Congress obviously the power to pass laws, to declare war, to ratify treaties. So the executive branch will craft treaties with foreign states, but the Senate has to approve those treaties. Likewise, the executive branch will be given the power to nominate judges, ambassadors, and other federal officers, but the language is with the advice and consent of the Senate, meaning the Senate has to approve them. Right? Anyone watching American political news watched that process of the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court that was so wildly controversial. That was the vision of the framers, right? That the Senate would play that very important role in making, the nomination of the president really contingent upon approval by the other branch of government. And of course, it gives Congress the right to remove the executive through the process of impeachment. Impeachment is a much, much more complicated, much more involved process in removing the executive than what the framers were familiar with in a parliamentary system like Great Britain. And we'll have some time to talk about that. But it takes very little to remove a prime minister. It takes a great deal to remove a president in the United States or in any presidential system through the process of impeachment. You may know that President Nixon was forced out of office. He was forced out of office because he was finally convinced by his own advisors that he did not have the votes in the Democratic-dominated Congress to survive an impeachment process. So he resigned to avoid impeachment. You may know that President Clinton was impeached. Now, the reason I mention this is because often people confuse the term impeachment with removal. Impeachment is a process, a two-part process. There are articles of impeachment drawn up and drafted in the House of Representatives. This is basically like being indicted by the House of Representatives. So you are charged with, the Constitution says high crimes and misdemeanors. And then the Senate handles the case, tries the president. And if the Senate finds the president guilty of what the House has accused the president of in the articles of impeachment, then a vote for impeachment, a vote for conviction means the president would be removed from office. So President Clinton was impeached for officially perjury. It was a deeply political and politicized process, mainly having to do with the Monica Lewinsky affair. When he said, "I did not have sex with that woman," but of course, it turned out he did. So he was impeached, but not convicted by the Senate. So he was impeached, but did not get removed from office. There's now a good deal of talk about the possibility of impeaching President Trump. The problem for those who support impeachment is that the Republicans are still in control of the Senate. So it would be quite a simple matter for the democratically controlled House to impeach the president, a very different matter for the Republican-controlled Senate to convict. Article 2 specifies the powers of the executive branch. And again, it's kind of not incidental that it's Article 2 and not Article 1, because again, the prevailing ideas is that Congress was the center of it. The framers, it's often said that the framers envisioned congressional government, not presidential government. And in fact, for the first century and a half, it's fair to say that we had congressional government. Only with the birth of the modern presidency, firmly established after World War II, firmly after FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and his response to the Great Depression, and then World War II, and the powers that accrued after that, do we move into a period of presidential government. And then reaching at such a level in the 1960s and 70s under Nixon, when he wages a secret war in Cambodia and things like that, that some started to use the term imperial presidency, that the presidency was no longer not just the most important branch of government, but it was now beyond the control of the congressional branch to rein in. So it was a kind of imperial office. At any rate, Article 2 gives the president the official title and role as commander-in-chief. I don't know how long this has not been... Okay, so if I have said this already, please just fast forward the video. But somehow I hit the pause button. So I'm gonna say it's somewhere around here. The framers had these twin fears, of too much power of the central government and not enough power, leaving the kind of the mob. So states had their reserved powers within the system of federalism, right? In the case of conflict, again, if I've gone over this, just fast forward. I don't know when I somehow hit pause. The Supremacy Clause of the Constitution makes clear that conflicts between federal and state authorities are to be decided in the favor of the federal government. The Supremacy Clause says the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So therefore, any law passed by states must be consistent with the U.S. Constitution. Today, you cannot have a state pass laws that would segregate on the basis of race, because that would be fundamentally inconsistent with the federal Constitution. And I also need to make note of this major loophole that will become evident decades from the founding, that is known as the Elastic Clause. And what this means is that the language of the Constitution says that Congress, the federal government is given these enumerated powers, and Congress in particular, to regulate things like interstate commerce. It also states that it has those enumerated powers, but it also has the power to pass all laws necessary and proper to make those enumerated powers real. Now, that doesn't sound like, maybe a big deal, but it is precisely that language that Congress has the power to pass all laws necessary and proper to, for example, carry out its enumerated power to regulate interstate commerce, that the federal government will finally bring justice to African Americans in the South. It is only through that Elastic Clause, for example, that segregation, Jim Crow, American apartheid is finally brought to an end. For example, hotels were, and many other public accommodations were segregated until the year I was born. Congress finally, passed a law saying, and the Supreme Court signed off on it, that Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce meant that it could tell states that it had no right to pass laws segregating, disallowing African Americans from equal access to public accommodations like hotels and those kinds of things. Because hotels, for example, were absolutely essential to the practice of interstate commerce, truckers and, whatever. So it was that Elastic Clause that has been so important to achieving justice in the area of civil rights that we should be rightfully proud of. So finally, this chart is kind of the framers, as I see it, the kind of framers' answer to their twin fears of too much power at the tyranny of the central government and tyranny of the mob. How do they solve that? Well, they diffused power. Yes, they granted more power to the central government than the Articles of Confederation had given to it, but they didn't leave it at that. They diffused that greater level of power in two ways. Horizontally, they established following Montesquieu, the doctrine of separation of powers. So the legislative branch has its role, executive has its role, the judiciary has its role, and it is that checking and balancing, as Montesquieu had prescribed, that allows a stronger, more powerful central government to be prevented from becoming tyrannical. Also, power is diffused vertically through the system of federalism. The federal government has its enumerated powers, the states have their reserved powers, and it is that sharing of power between center and state that tyranny is avoided. But the reality is my final chart here, as I hope I've captured well here. The y-axis, the vertical axis here is the degree to which power is concentrated at the center, Washington, if you will, and the horizontal axis is time. We have a period of time under which we operated under the Articles of Confederation, and it was clear, as I hope I've made clear, that it was not adequately, the central government was not adequately endowed with power to function in any way as a sovereign state. So they adopt the new Constitution, and we see this instant leap in the level of centralized power in the United States. But it doesn't, the story doesn't end there, right? I mean, time continues to move forward, and the reality is, as I've tried to capture with this, is that over time we've seen an increasing a continuing increase in the level of centralized power that Washington holds, but it's not been perfectly linear. And so we will see, as we get to our discussion of, say, civil rights, or the presidency or Congress, what have you, that there have been times when, say, the Supreme Court just turned its back on, say, the central premises or central principles of equal rights, due process, and allow states to, in the South, establish and maintain a system of apartheid. And as either I've said before, you've already heard, or it was when I was. Okay, so I paused again. The point here is, this is the design, or this is the way I conceive of the actual design of the American system that is different from what the original framers. This is the system that the framers had. This kind of federalism that diffuses power vertically, separation of powers that diffuses it horizontally. The reality is we have an Articles of Confederation system that lasts for a very short time, inadequately empowered to function like a sovereign state. Adopt a new constitution, an instant jump in the level of centralized power, but time does not stop there. Time continues to move forward. And as I try to capture with this curvy line, over time, it's clear that power has continued to accrue at the central level at the expense of states. But it's not been perfectly linear, and as we'll see, there were times when the Supreme Court just turned its back on the South and allowed southern states to establish and maintain a system of apartheid. And then it changed and started to issue decisions like Brown versus Board of Education that desegregates education, and more power has accrued to the central level. That's the history, that's the constitutional history of where power lies. Next week, we'll get into the business of how some of this works in more detail. Okay, so I'm sorry about, if I've kind of been redundant. I don't know why this pause button keeps getting hit. I'll have to figure that little quirk out. But we're at 2 hours and 6 minutes, so it's shorter than a full lecture. Hope this made sense, but again, don't forget, make me do my job. If there are parts of this that do not make good sense or are not clear, don't forget to do your part, which is to make me do mine. Okay? See you next week, guys.